So, a much requested series. We're going to go and once again talk about the individual ship classes within the context of the game. 2.0 has come, it's thrown in a couple of additional modifiers. Armor works differently now, hull now works differently, and of course there is the combat computers. Today we're going to be talking about the very first class within the game, which is of course the Corvette. Now there is a bunch of stuff in here that has not been optimally been tested, but because we're going to go and talk mainly about roles, about when ships should be used at what different stages of the game. This is the start of the game, the early game, the mid game, the late game, and finally we're going to do a test on mass Corvettes in the late to late game. So let's get underway here and let's get started and let's take a look at our ship designs, of course in the ship designer, and specifically let's take a look at our starter Corvette. So the starter Corvette is incredibly bare bones. So we've got 3 slots on the Interceptor slot, of course, that we can fill out with various things. Lasers, mass drivers, and of course more lasers, because missiles are not necessarily something that we want to get into straight away. So we kind of want to go and min-max or mix and mash these lasers and kinetics together, mainly because of the way the modifiers work here. So because of the modifiers, in terms of lasers, they do shield damage reduction and they have a increased damage onto armor. Kinetics are the exact opposite, and they do a little bit more damage, although their accuracy is generally a little bit lower. So does this mean that you want to go in and say, hey, do we gonna want to go full lasers or full kinetics? It really depends on the situation. If the enemy is going to go full armor, then you want to go full laser. If the enemy is full shields, then you may want to go for full mass driver. With the AI, however, it's generally a bit of a mix of, so you can go and mix your ship designs there. Of course, keeping your eye on what the enemy has, looking at their ship designs and how they're laid out is critical at this stage of the game. Let's go and take a look at some of the early game designs here. So this is a missile boat design. It's by itself is very, very standard. A missile boat with a single laser that can either be changed to a kinetic if necessary, but it also has a missile on top of it. Now the missiles are an interesting case because of their retargeting ability, but also because of their shield penetration. That means that they will never ever damage any shields because they will rip straight through them. They don't do any additional damage to armor, but they do additional damage to hull. And the real question here is, what does the enemy have? If the enemy has a lot of armor, you may not want to go for nuclear missiles or just missiles in general, because you will need to chew down through that armor in particular. So what you can do there is maybe change that around a little bit, go for an interceptor design that is a little bit more specific to the situation, and say, hey, I want to put some autocannons on this. Now, autocannons in general are particularly good. They do additional shield damage. They have a massive reduction in armor damage, but their high accuracy and tracking make them very, very deadly, even in the early game. And we can make sure that this is augmented a little bit by the auxiliary fire control unit, which gives us an additional +5 chance to hit, which is a very, very big deal. In addition, we can increase our firepower by using combat computers, whether or not it's Swarm or the Picket setup. Now, in general, you kind of want to make sure that your evasion is relatively high by the mid-game, but in the early game it doesn't really matter all that much, so feel free to go for the Picket defense setup, because then you will be able to have additional firepower, but more importantly additional tracking, which in combination with the autocannon is going to be incredibly useful. Then we take a look at the, let's take a look here, the mid-game weapon. So the mid-game, again, it's an interceptor style class Corvette. Again, you can go for missiles in this particular case, but it's not always necessary. Interceptors and Corvettes in general kind of lose their, how should I put this, their usefulness in the mid game, only to come back stronger in the late game, but we'll get back to that. So when it comes to interceptors, once again, having autocannons is incredibly good because of their high accuracy, their damage to shields, but also their damage to hull. Armor, once again, is definitely not something that is very useful when it comes to attacking. Once again, you want to go with as high as evasion as you can. Now, evasion itself is rather complicated. It maxes out at 90. That is a hard cap. Nothing can go over 90 evasion. So feel free to play around with your combat computers to get as high evasion as possible, because especially by the mid game, you are going to need it because interceptors will die very quickly. Here's kind of a different design that I came up with. It's completely useless in my personal opinion. You kind of want to use this design if you have a full Corvette fleet floating about and you don't want to have destroyers slowing things down, especially in space where there is a lot of systems and no wormholes or any gates that you can move quickly in between. If you want a fast mobile ship that can also take down enemy strike craft and missiles, then try to play around with this particular design. It uses the Sapien combat computer. Normally you would go for an advanced combat computer, maxing out your evasion over at 84, but the addition of the point defense allows you to take down any sort of incoming missiles. So let's take a look at the late game design. Once we arrive in the mid game, Corvettes are kind of useless, but once we research the torpedo variety of weapons, the missile boat variety of the Corvette becomes incredibly useful once again. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. This is your fleet buster. This is what takes down end-game weapon systems like destroyers, battleship, cruisers. These bad boys will rip through them relatively quickly. Because of their incredibly high evasion through the Sapien combat computer picket setup. It's got 90 evasion, which is the highest you can get. It's got high shields, it's got high armor, it is incredibly fast due to advanced afterburner, but most importantly, it's got devastator torpedoes, which do a damage from 275 all the way up to 445, which is incredibly high. It's got 100% accuracy. Its tracking is a little bit so-so, but once again, the combat computer helps with that quite a lot. Now, you can use this particular design to supplement your existing fleets, or if you're feeling particularly ballsy, you can use this particular design to fly around in gigantic swarms of Corvettes. And I've done a couple of simulations with them versus Fallen Empire fleets, and I will show you the design that I was playing around with, which is what I call the late game Corvette. It costs 337 minerals per pop. It does 28 damage per shot, which is by itself is particularly great, and with 90% is probably one of the most difficult ships in the game to shoot. If you fly around with a large fleet of these bad boys, you'll be able to take on pretty much anything. So I've done a couple of simulations where I put 100 Corvettes versus a similar power Fallen Empire fleet, somewhere around 51,000 fleet power, and every single time the Corvettes actually managed to come out on top. And there's a good reason for this. The main reason is, well, because of all this firepower is condensed in so many small ships, losing just one Corvette doesn't really do all that much. Whereas a large fleet that has a large amount of firepower condensed in only one ship, it means that as soon as they lose just one of them, a big chunk of that firepower is taken off the field. Basically, you are working with redundant fire systems. Being able to swarm the enemy with tons of ships, and basically you only lose one, who cares? Because there are still 99 more that can crap out torpedoes towards the enemy without any problems. And this is something that you may want to play around with. And like I said, a bunch of simulations do show that Corvettes will come out on top pretty much every single time. So yeah, the late game Corvette is a absolute game changer. You may want to play around with it for a little bit. Anyway, just to recap, Corvettes in the mid game, they're useless. In the early game, they're great. Once the Devastator torpedo comes onto the field, they become great once more. Corvettes, very good, but sometimes need a little bit of love. Although in the late game, they pretty much become unstoppable. We're going to continue this series with destroyers in the very near future. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you like this particular series, feel free to give it a like and or subscribe, because more is coming. We're going to go through the entire range, from destroyers to cruisers to the almighty battleship who reigns supreme in 2.0.2. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, take good care of yourselves and, as always, each other.